Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're about to start the session. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are starting our main session on access and diversity. I would like to introduce our chairperson, Ms. Gusel Kafarova, chairwoman and for the Organization of Integration of Azerbaijani Youth to Europe.
Thank you very much. Can we say that they will come here to the here place, not to sit there, just come up?
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, the chair requests if people could come to the front, please, to have a... because of the camera and the webcast, so that if you are talking, people can see you. And I also have one other request, is that if you're taking the microphone, could you please state your name and your organization so that for the captioners? Thank you.
Should I start? Yeah. Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We now resume the meeting, and I open this morning session dealing with the access and diversity. My co-moderators who will run the session for us, Mrs. Karen Rose of the Internet Society and Mrs. Orly Okolo from Google Africa. Remote moderators are Mrs. Claudia Selle, AT&8, and Mrs. Raquel Ghetto, ICOC Brazil. Issue of access and diversity have been discussed in each of the 6 IGF meetings. We have had discussions about essential infrastructures such as internet exchange points and the deployment of fiber optic cable. Last year in Nairobi, I understand the main issue was about the mobile internet. This year we will focus on social and economic development, and we have 7 experts to provide comment and the ideas for our discussions. The goal of the session is to have a broad discussion with all of you in the audience. Please be ready to take the microphone and pose your questions or give short replies based on your own experience. I emphasize short reply, please. Our moderators will take us through a number of the questions. You can find a list in the program in your paper. For Azerbaijan, I would like to emphasize the importance of the role of government in creating a favorable enabling environment. The President has begun initiative to support private sector ownership, innovation and scientific research, notably through the State Foundation for Information Technologies Development. We have seen the country's ICT sector double in the past 3 years. Income from the sector in 2011 was approximately $1.7 billion. Like the rest of the world, the mobile sector has been very dynamic, both 3G and 4G. Azerbaijan is the member of the Trans-Asia Super Information Highway TASIM, an important regional initiative whose purpose is to lay transnational fiber optic cable line covering the Eurasian countries, mainly from the Western Europe to Eastern Asia. This type of initiative is important to landlocked countries. Government working with and supporting the private sector and research community has been important to the growth of the ICT sector. So we will now hear from the moderators who will further set the scene for this afternoon's dialogue. Let's think about the barriers to access and use and also opportunities. We should be positive and take away positive messages from increasing access and diversity. As I mentioned before, the session will be moderated by the Mrs. Karen Rose and Mrs. Orly Okolo, with remote participation facilitated by Claudia Selle and Mrs. Raquel Ghetto. So over to you, ladies and gentlemen. Mrs. Karen, here you are.
Thank you, Mrs. Chairwoman, and good morning, everyone. My name is Karen Rose, and I'm Senior Director of Strategic Development and Business Planning at the Internet Society. On behalf of the IGF organizers and the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Committee, I'd like to welcome you to this main session on access and diversity. And I would argue that the issue of access and diversity and the topics we'll be discussing in this session are some of the most important of the entire IGF. Because without access and diversity, few of the other internet governance issues we discuss in this forum have any practical impact. As noted, in keeping with the theme of the 7th IGF, we will explore access and diversity from a perspective of promoting economic, human, and social development. And in order to do so, we're going to seek to go beyond what is often a binary proposition of discussing disparities between those who have access and those who do not. This is sometimes too simple of a context. Rather, we will be looking at internet access and diversity as more of a value proposition, and the issues that need to be addressed in order to transform the unconnected into empowered users, users into internet creators, and internet creators into the innovators that will fuel the economic transformation and social development we seek. We've been asked to explore 5 topics today. We'll start with infrastructure, move to mobile and innovation, go to human empowerment, then free flow of information and multilingualism. We're very fortunate to be joined today by some of the world's most foremost thinkers in this area. Before I turn it over to my co-moderator to get us started, I'd just like to offer a word a little bit on our limitations. As has been noted, we've been asked to tackle an enormous topic here today and many critical subtopics. We've asked the panelists to keep their remarks concise, and I would now ask the same of everyone here as they consider the interventions and comments on the panel. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my co-moderator, Ori Okolo, to get us started. Ori?
Thank you, Karen. Before we get started, I would just like to ask to introduce the panelists, just with their names and their titles, and if you could just raise your hand so the audience knows who I'm referring to, although I guess they can see the names as well. We're privileged to have, as Karen said, a great group of speakers on the panel. First off, we have Dr. Bitang Ndemo, who's the Permanent Secretary for Ministry of Information and Communication in Kenya. We also have Dr. Tariq Kamel, Senior Advisor to the President of ICANN and former Minister of ICT in Egypt. We have Mr. Yanis Karklins, Assistant Director General for UNESCO's Communication and Information Sector. Ms. Yak Smki, Women's Rights Advocacy Coordinator, who's also Women's Networking Support Program of APC. Mr. Peter Major, he is the coordinator of Dynamic Coalition on Accessibility and Disabilities, so also known as DCAD. Mr. Cecil McCain, who's the Director of Post and Telecommunications of Jamaica. Ms. Jacqueline or Jackie Ruff, right next to me, who's the VP for International Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs with Verizon. And Mr. Satish Babu, who's the Director of the International Center for Free and Open Source Software in India. And with that, I'll get right to the opening question. We'll start off with addressing around the issue of access, underlying access is infrastructure. And the question is how, with the growing increased demand for bandwidth and for lower cost of internet access, and with the revenue shifts affecting investment in broadband infrastructure and access networks, how do we deal with this issue, or what I'd like to call who pays for all of this? And how do we meet the growing demand, as I said, for fast access, quick speed, lower prices, both on the mobile side and on the broadband side. If I can start off with you, Dr. Ndemo, can you share your experiences perhaps from Kenya and from Africa in terms of what is the thinking around this question?
Thank you, Ori. Until 4 years ago, Kenya did not have sufficient broadband, and what we did was to work with the private sector through public-private partnerships to lay the fiber optics that landed in the coast of Kenya. Then internally, we have worked very closely again with the private sector to develop the terrestrial fiber, and now we are working on the last mile. We have paid attention to those in the rural areas by creating a value proposition for creating ICTs in the rural areas, and soon we are hopefully going to cover the whole country. We have subsidized the broadband to universities through the local NREN, the National Research and Education Network was fully funded to provide broadband to universities, and we're hoping to get to high schools and primary schools throughout the country. So the government plays a very key role in terms of creating access to broadband to a large extent. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll turn over next to Mr. McCain. I think we've heard a lot about the role of government, and Kenya has been known for driving this model of public-private partnerships. Can you share your experience on the same, and maybe speak to also what other policy measures can be taken to drive or to address the question of investment in infrastructure?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. like the experience in Kenya, Jamaica had a similar experience when we liberalized the telecommunications sector in early 2000. There was a revolutionary change to the entire telecommunications sector, led by investments in voice. The licensing regime allowed for the increased international bandwidth into Jamaica, and with that came significant investments in terms of international bandwidth in Jamaica. These investments, however, unfortunately did not translate into increased internet usage. In fact, the subscription rates for internet is below 10% in Jamaica. And that has been the challenge. We see, like Kenya, we realize that government does need to play a role. And as a result, we had, through the Universal Service Fund, we have brought the internet, we are bringing internet access to most communities, schools, libraries, post offices, and thereby enabling the communities through which this backbone pass to have access to the internet. We recognize, however, that the investments, however, need to be demand-driven. And that we recognize is a major difficulty that governments have to deal with. How do you get demand? How do you create demand? Is it simply a case of providing? How do you provide access to those in need? Do you give them free connections? Do you give them discounted access, or do you create services such that the demand will be driven by need or perceived need? I believe that the answer to increasing investment in broadband lies in us understanding the delicate balance between supply and demand, and how do you stimulate investments which would generate adequate demand for broadband.
Thank you. And I'll turn over to Jackie now. I think, and that has set quite the framework in addressing what I think remains the pressing question of both backhaul and last mile and demand, and what can be done based on your experience, and what are you seeing? What are the trends in the industry in terms of the question of how to invest in infrastructure and also address the question of demand?
Sure. Thank you. Let me first, I'm hearing an echo, but I guess it's okay. Let me first describe Verizon Communications and the perspective that we bring to this. We are in the United States a very big provider of mobile services, fiber to the home, every type of infrastructure that you could think of. We also have a global network of undersea cables, and we provide enterprise services, cloud services around the world. So I'm bringing those perspectives as well as that of following trends generally. And I think the previous speakers really set the foundation very nicely. I want to talk about what are some of the regulatory and public policy frameworks that we find to be conducive to getting private investment as part of that public-private partnership that was described. So a few categories. One, Dr. Ndemo talked about, and our moderator also talked about, which is that if you want investment in one part of the chain of the infrastructure, it's very important to also have the other parts of that infrastructure be robust. So that would be your international connectivity, your backhaul, your interconnection like ISPs, and then your last mile. So looking at those who may be part of the private capital, the question then would be, are there barriers to that private sector type of investment? For example, foreign ownership limits or requirements, if we are talking about certain services like cloud services, are there requirements that actually stand in the way of certain types of services, like a requirement to have all of your facilities in country rather than some being done through a cloud? Those kinds of things, or technical requirements to use a certain technology, or have import duties on hardware and software. That is the examination of whether there are barriers. Then are there incentives that could be adopted, like tax policy, or the use of universal service funds, as was mentioned before, access to rights of way. Are there pro-competition policies? Is the spectrum policy pro-competitive? Are the licensing policies flexible, as was mentioned in Jamaica? Is there a level playing field for various types of providers? Another important factor, if you look at trends, is there a national plan really putting all of these pieces together? And some of the most successful countries, such as Korea, have always had national plans that bring together agencies. I also would just touch for a moment on the demand and creating that. And I agree with the previous speakers that we really need to look at both of those questions. We find even in the U.S., we do not have as many people using broadband as is available. And the surveys show that one of the primary factors is that they don't think it's meaningful for them. It's not affordability even in our low-income areas, and I recently saw a survey in Brazil that came up with exactly the same question. What is this service going to do for my life? And therefore, I think we should talk during this panel about things like e-health, e-government, e-education, distance learning. I know there's a lot of that in Africa, for example. And the more we can do that type of demand, I think the more we will close the gap between availability, which is increasing, and actual usage.
Thank you. And if I can turn over to you, Satish, just do you have any response to some of the remarks from the panelists? Particularly, I think, on this question, it's I think we're moving towards a theme where it's infrastructure alone is not enough to ensure access. Can you perhaps share some of your thoughts on what, in response, on what we can do to overcome this when we're talking about access?
Thank you, Ori. First of all, we see that there are two aspects to the question. There is infrastructure, and there are the other factors that promote the use of the infrastructure and drive demand. On the infrastructure, what I could hear the various panelists, the points that have been made relate to the four aspects of infrastructure: the backhaul, the last mile, the international, and now the cloud. Now, we do not necessarily have coherence among the policies that relate to all these four. In fact, the cloud is very new, and the national policies do not yet encompass all these four in a matter of in a coherent manner. So I think that is one area that we have to look at. The other area relates to all the other the demand side of services, for example, social innovation and all the other e-health and government and so on, and SMEs. I believe that SMEs have a major role to play, and we need to ensure that small businesses can also survive. Of course, the larger business perspectives, for example, pro-competitive regulation, has already been mentioned, and those, of course, are not new, and we continue to kind of call for those kind of regulations. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think now that we've heard from the panel, in the interest of time, I will move over to Stuart. If you can provide, speak from the floor and provide your input from the workshop where this issue was discussed. If you could make your intervention now. That's fine.
Thank you very much. My name is Stuart Hamilton. I'm reporting back from workshop 130, which was on what policymakers want and how libraries and other community services can deliver in terms of public access to the internet. This was organised by IFLA, my organisation, Electronic Information for Libraries, and ISOC. We had a full room, a very engaged discussion, remote participation, and a panel made up of very diverse multi-stakeholders to address this issue. We know that there are over 2 billion people now online, but of course not all of them have access to the internet in their own homes. So public access to the internet is an extremely important thing. Our policymakers on the panel, which included representatives from Romania and from Bhutan, but we also touched upon Ghana and Poland and many other countries, talked about how they were exploring public access solutions to meet community needs. And we discussed that policymakers want solutions that take advantage of existing infrastructure and expertise and also have the flexibility to partner with the private sector. So the workshop focused on libraries and how they can fit into this role. The experience of our participants was that libraries are very well suited to this. They know their community, they understand their needs, and they're able to tie their services not only to these needs, but also to national policies and community policies for development and for access to information. Libraries offer expertise in counselling, physical space, skills and training development, and access to some other things which you're just not going to get through mobile technology. Very often when people are looking for jobs, they need to print out CVs, they need to access printed documents, and libraries offer these facilities. We talked very much about the examples in the workshop about how libraries are offering access to information on jobs, health information, services for women and children. So in the interests of keeping this short, there is now a full report on the IFLA website at www.ifla.org, and the conversation will continue this afternoon in room 7 at 2:30 when the Dynamic Coalition on Public Access through Libraries meets for the first time. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Stuart, and for keeping it brief and comprehensive. Did you have an... So I think before we take questions from the floor, I'd like to allow for... Are there any questions remotely from the remote participants? No questions. Okay. I think we'll open the session up now for questions to the floor. If you could just please... your
good
name,
morning, everyone.
Your name and the organization you're representing. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Subhi Chaturvedi and I represent the academic and the civil society community from India. It is an important region, so to say, because we're discussing the issue of access and diversity, and I couldn't agree more with Karen that this is one of the most important sessions that we could look at on this question. I think it's extremely important that we look at this region, because when we're talking about enabling environments, and that's the focus of this theme, we're looking at an ecosphere that looks at facilitating infrastructure which can take us from not just being infrastructure to a point where it can facilitate penetration and broadband. I'd like to start by giving you very briefly some of the numbers that we're looking at. On the question of diversity, India has over 18 languages that are recognized in its constitution. This is a rupee note that has about 15 scripts which are written out of respect for diversity. We have interesting levels of literacy. So there's literacy, no literacy, and there's keypad literacy. And that's where I'm coming from. In terms of interventions and where we're at, there are about 700 million active mobile users, about 125 million users on the internet. There is a USO fund which looks at every user, every mobile telephone user in India contributing about 5% of their charges onto the USO fund, which is the Universal Service Obligation. And I'm just coming to two key points. We've had a fantastic story as far as telecom is concerned. This is one of the key revolutions in the unifying factors of this very diverse nation, other than railways, movies and cricket. And this has happened because we have a system that has worked locally, that is nimble-footed, that has been able to do at least 3 national revisions, unlike the system at the ITU, which last saw revisions 24 years ago. And what my key point here is when we're looking at access, we're looking at countries which are very diverse. So I believe a solution, a blanket solution which is being proposed at the moment, that one size fits all, cannot be a solution, because there are clearly models that have worked. And I'll just take about 2 seconds more, Rory, and I'll end there.
Okay.
I think it's a very important thing, because we're having this conversation at the IGF, and it's a bottoms-up approach. We cannot look at facilitating access through a top-down approach, especially at a platform where none of us are going to be there in the room in some of the most key decision-making sessions. So that's my submission. If we could look at more domestic, more local solutions, and look at solutions which have actually worked and not try and reinvent the wheel, I think we owe it to our generations to come. And this is a resource that's very, very crucial and important to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your intervention. If we could have, I'll take maybe 2 or 3 more questions at the same time. If you could go and speak at the microphone. Is there anyone else with a question or intervention? Okay, great. If we could start there, since you're already at the mic.
Good morning. My name is Naveen Tandon, and I represent the Internet Service Providers Association. Just not in the form of a question, but just an observation and for the information and for everybody in the house. I would like to mention that infrastructure certainly is quite important and critical for the growth of access and diversity in a country. And here I would like to inform that India has specially taken a remarkable step in the formulation of a broadband plan, and they have already tied up almost $4 billion, which will be spent over next 2 years to provide connectivity to almost 250,000 villages. On the policy front, there have been major initiatives taken already. The National Telecom Policy of 2012 talks about growth avenues, and there have been impressive growth targets for the broadband, and they plan to achieve almost 600 million by 2020 and 175 million by 2017. The policy document does talks about the enabling framework for cloud, international connectivity, and some regulatory policy which will certainly help grow the telecom sector. So we can have diversity, we can talk about e-governance content, but unless and until we have the required infrastructure in place, the required highway is not in place, then it will be very difficult to provide connectivity to especially who are there in the rural areas who really don't understand what an internet means unless they actually see it. Thank you so much.
Are these documents online for people who might want to take a look?
Oh, yes, and after the meeting is over, I can certainly share those documents. I can share my card and accordingly share those documents with you.
Okay, fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Fatima Cambronero. I am ISOC ambassador, but I will speak in my personal capacity. The question is, there has been tremendous growth in international undersea cable capacity around the world, including in Africa. What are the solutions that would help bring this capacity from the coast and major cities and into the interior? Thank you.
Thank you. If I can ask Dr. Ndemo to speak and share his experience, because that's something we're actually working on, and if any other panelists would like to respond as well. Okay.
I want to add on what I said with respect to the experience in Kenya. Initially, we focused on the demand side of the broadband, and what we are working now is we worked on the supply side of broadband, and we are now focusing on the demand side by doing a lot more to make sure that those who are not connected are indeed connected to especially in the rural areas. As you know, in Africa, most rural areas take much longer, but we've invested in terms of creating rural digital centers that will be used mostly with education and access to many other services. At the same time, we have gotten into local application development, and this is the fastest growing area now, and some of the applications are targeting the rural populations. Most of you probably know Kenya has been in the lead with respect to mobile money And also we are coming up with other applications targeting the healthcare sector, the agricultural sector. Responding to my colleague here from Jamaica, and as Jackie said, there is a way of creating demand for the supply that is increasing. Indeed, in Kenya we say that actually what at some point people saw in the movie Field of Dreams, they said, build it and they will come. We are very happy with the uptake of broadband in Kenya, and it did not just happen. It's the government specifically worked on the demand side, and by digitizing, providing some of the services that I've said, then you actually get the balance you need and ensure that everybody participates in the realm of the ICT. Thank you.
Thank you. Yanis, if you had an intervention.
Yes, thank you. I would like to strengthen this point on a very clear link between infrastructure and content. It is a little bit a chicken and egg problem. You cannot have infrastructure without having also content, because if there is no use of infrastructure, there is no return on investment, there is no possibility of reinvesting these funds which have been received by offering services. And of course you cannot provide services if you do not have infrastructure. From other point, we need also to understand that there should be right policies, because the study which UNESCO, OECD and ISOC did last year proved that there is a very direct and positive correlation between the volume of local content which is kept on local internet infrastructure, which includes also local ISPs, and the access price what local internet users are paying. More local content you have, if you have right policy, if you have ISP, the quality of service will be better and the access price will be lower. A bit paradoxical, but that is what happens. We did it with with two assumptions which are proven to be correct, that the majority of consumption of locally is consumption of local content. And another assumption which we made was that the local traffic always is cheaper than international traffic. Therefore, I think we need to speak about both simultaneously, investment in infrastructure and also stimulation of production of local content.
Thank you. If one last intervention, I think Peter, you wanted to say?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to follow up on what Mr. Conklin said, and I want to react to the comments of the Indian lady about the local initiatives. Being on the Dynamic Coalition of Disability, we have a very good UN Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which has been signed by 154 countries out of the 193. However, if we look at the bottlenecks of the implementation, it's mostly the local initiatives, and basically that's the heart of the matter. The local initiatives are to be really fostered and really to be encouraged. Thank you.
And the last, you have the honors of making the last intervention. It's been a great session. Thanks.
Thank you. I believe that indeed one of the challenges is that balance between supply and demand, and most governments do focus on the supply side. When the government of Jamaica started to focus on the demand side, we found that we needed to deal with a number of issues. Literacy, as was found in India, content, and access to financing of SMEs, who would be one of the major driving forces to putting content online. And we found that, it is in addressing these issues that you would address an issue of sustainable demand. Most countries often, pay for internet bandwidth for persons, but this is not sustainable demand. We have to generate sustainable demand so that the industry itself can grow. And I believe that's what we need to focus on in terms of ensuring that there is growth of internet usage within our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, I will hand over for the next session to Karen.
Thanks so much, Ori. And I think this next session is a great follow-on from what we've just been discussing. We noted in that panel that in order for infrastructure and for demand to be there needs to be content and there needs to be a relevancy for getting that connection. In this session, we'll talk about mobile and innovation in particular. And the framing question here is, what does it take to create opportunities and for entrepreneurs, for youth, and other developing country stakeholders to participate in mobile innovation and mobile development? Where are the linkages with local content? What more needs to be done to promote those opportunities from becoming just a mobile phone user to a mobile data innovator? And to start off, I'd like to turn to Dr. Kamal.
Thank you, Karen, for giving me this opportunity. And before I talk about mobile and innovation, I wanted to share some statistics with the audience about the overall mobile and internet evolution. According to the ITU numbers, we have over 6 billion mobile users worldwide, 1.5 billion fixed phone users. We have, according to the ICANN statistics, over 3 billion IPv4 addressees and 200 million domain names, and we have over 1 billion mobile users that are using the internet, or more or less according to that numbers. In 2015, we are expecting to have 3.5 mobile users using the internet, one of the fastest growing rates worldwide and the fastest growing industries worldwide. So if we want to reflect that on the developing countries very specifically, and I'm going to pick up Africa as an example, ICANN has been recently doing a strategy for Africa, or developing a strategy for Africa together with the African Union and the African community. And there has been a number of very interesting observations that I would like to share with the panel. The African mobile penetration is close to 100%, which is more or less the world average. We have around 750 to 800 million mobile African users. The number of internet users, however, in Africa are around 150 million, which is something like around 15 to 20% of the overall population, and around 6.5% of the global internet users. However, the number of growth of the mobile internet users in Africa is double digit and is exceeding 40%, which is one of the highest growth rates worldwide. In addition to that, we have a number of observations. Yannis Karklins has mentioned one of them, that there are clearly consumer shifts in Africa. The mobile internet has exceeded the fixed internet by far. We have for the first time as well that the user is generating his own content, and in addition to that, the growing traffic in data has and video has exceeded for the first time the growing rates in traffic in voice. What does this mean? That we are now being confronted with a new platform of mobile connectivity in Africa that is enabling the economy and that this is enabling socio-economic growth. But we need to take it to the next level. It's not only just basic connectivity, and it's not just basic access. We need to take it to the next level, that it really fosters innovation and contributes to the overall GDP growth in the African nation. There are wonderful examples for applications in e-commerce in Africa, in Kenya and other parts of Africa, but I would like to tackle a very important issue which is related to the development of the logical infrastructure on top of this physical infrastructure. We talked about content, but between the layers of content and the physical infrastructure, we have a missing layer, which is enabling of the domain name industry. And this is where we want to focus within the next couple of years, specifically to empower young entrepreneurs and to empower innovation and to empower incubators and the establishment of incubators for startups to enable the domain name industry, because it's one of the drivers for content development, as it has been mentioned. We need to build on the success that we have witnessed in the African continent and in any parts of and other parts of the world from a developing country's perspective, and develop the next layer really that enables entrepreneurship and enables innovation. And I think we have a wonderful opportunity to do that in Africa and outside Africa. The next billion internet users are definitely coming from the developing countries, and it is estimated that within the next 20 years that we will add another 4 to 5 billion internet users. Probably most of them are coming from the developing countries. The population in our part of the world is a young population, and 60% of the population are under the age of 30 years, which gives another opportunity for innovation and for driving innovation forward. So I think we need to be working together on a roadmap for building on the success that happened in the mobile industry, specifically in Africa and in the developing countries, adding the next layer that would foster content development and specifically multilingual content development. Realize that mobile internet advances economy through innovation, and it provides a wonderful global launchpad for ideas that will really generate tomorrow's great economic opportunities.
Dr. Kamel,
empowers creative thought and risk-taking. And never innovation has had really a fertile field to grow like it has now through the mobile industry, simply because it is ubiquitous and it is borderless. So we have a wonderful opportunity really to mesh the young population in the world in a new innovative form, using the new innovative platform that really enable the risk-taking young entrepreneurs from all over the world to come together.
Dr.
And
Kamel?
we need really to provide them with the opportunities and not to marginalize them from the developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamel. And I think your comments were a wonderful segue to Dr. Ndemo. Dr. Ndemo, Kenya has been put forward, lauded, focused on for the innovation that it's had, particularly in the mobile area, the development of iHubs, the development of the industry of mobile applications for youth, for entrepreneurs. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what's going on in Kenya and what the government is doing and what the government is thinking about promoting opportunities for entrepreneurs and youth with mobile technology.
Thank you. I'll go straight to the answer. The secret in Kenya is that the government has provided open government data, which has enabled the youth to create many applications that are coming up. We are beginning to incubate some of these new startups. We are looking worldwide to find investors to come and partner with these young startups and grow them. And then we are creating an ecosystem that would ensure that we continuously get into innovation. So the secret for any government to succeed, you must provide the ingredients for innovation. That is data. That is how we are able to get into like agriculture, where we are trying to get digitized data. Healthcare, we are digitizing data there to create the applications. The financial sector, the government itself. So there is no other, there is no secrets. It's just open the data, the youth will do the rest. That is what Kenya is doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Ndembo. And I'd like to turn to Mr. Baru. Your area is in open source, open platforms. How does open source and open platform technology merge with mobile to provide opportunities for entrepreneurship and the growth of content?
Thank you. First of all, the digital opportunity that the mobile platforms represent open up a very large area, especially for micro enterprises and micro entrepreneurs, because the people that we're talking about are at the grassroots, at the edge. What is really opening up is a mobile marketplace, a marketplace that is at the grassroots. It is it's about local content, it's about local language content as well. Now, one of the factors that has the potential to influence the development of such a large marketplace with micro enterprises is open source. As we see today, the most innovative, some of the largest numbers of innovation, as well as the innovations with the maximum outreach, is actually happening on the open platforms. Currently, as an example, Android is leading the fray. We have an extraordinarily kind of mind-boggling number of innovations that are happening, and all mostly by the young people. Since it's open source, since there are no barriers, since the platforms are open, since there's a community that offers support for the development process, since there's also a group of people that you can borrow ideas from, this whole ideation process and the refinement of ideas, the open source paradigm actually makes all these processes much more simple and more viable. In particular, the technologies used are also open source. There are no barriers either of price or of licensing that prevent you from experimenting. And innovation happens through experimentation. So from that perspective, I think open source is definitely one of the very major contributing factors to the emerging digital opportunities and the marketplace itself. Thank you.
Thanks. And with that, I'm wondering if Jackie Ruff, you have any thoughts or comments based on what's been said by our panelists?
Sure. I'd like to tie together two trends that we've been discussing here. One is the huge expansion of mobile high-speed internet, because we really are in a new phase where there's a technology, LTE, long-term evolution that it's called, that's being adopted around the world and allows for very high-speed, high-quality mobile broadband. And obviously in the developing world, that is going to be the future. You combine that with what was mentioned earlier on cloud services. You've got the high-speed right here on your desk, in your lap, whatever. And then you have the ability to have the content and many of the functionalities elsewhere. So you don't have to have, if you're a small business, that huge set of hardware in your own office. A lot of things can happen elsewhere. And I think that this is key to innovation for so many of the different groups that we've talked about, because you can immediately get innovative services that are available in a way they've never been before, and then use those services to further create innovation. The final thought on all that is to ask the question, what is the policy environment? Now, on cloud services, there are a lot of things that are new about them, but in many ways they're similar to global services that we've had all along. So we need to make a careful look at, do we need new rules? Maybe some, but maybe not very many, in order to allow this innovative combination to really flourish, and look at that very, very carefully. And there's a lot of thinking being discussed even here at this conference. So we're in the midst of all this. Thank you.
We'll open the floor up to questions in a moment, but I'd like to ask Cecil McCain if you could provide some observations on the issue from your part of the world.
Thank you very much, Karen. Certainly, the experience of Kenya is notable. in the Caribbean, certainly, has been a challenge. We have had internet penetrations of over 100% for the last 5 years throughout the Caribbean. Yet the mobile use in terms of data has been very slow. Certainly access to open data and applications, open source applications, would certainly help to drive the development of innovation within that context. One of the challenges, of course, being in the western part of the world, is that cloud services which are available in our part of the world does come with a cost, and so it's difficult for the youth to invest in terms of, or do experimentation to create services, to create application through the use of cloud services. And similarly for small businesses, it's difficult because there's a cost component which would not normally have been there. So we would have to look at the cost context to determine how can we find that balance in terms to make it cost effective to put your services online, to access your services online, to access your information online. Certainly, we are going to need to develop on the open content aspect of things, and we believe that throughout the Caribbean, as recently, there has been a lot of apps development competitions which are driving not just the youth, but persons from within the communities to develop local content, local applications, local services to delivered over the internet, but more importantly, over mobile phones. And I believe that's where we need to focus our attention in terms of driving development of innovation and mobile services. We need to focus on that aspect of things. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to open the floor to questions, and while people are coming up, Yanis, you wanted to respond.
Actually, I wanted to add one dimension in this discussion and suggest that mobile technologies, and I'm not speaking exclusively about mobile phones, but also, all mobile devices, has a great potential in delivery of education services. And as in UNESCO, we're now working to first of all to understand how mobile technologies could be better used in education process, and stimulate the use of mobile technologies in education. We also think that mobile technologies could be a very good tool to address literacy issues. Unfortunately, still today we have about 10% of population in the world, around 775 million, which are illiterate. 46% of them are women and girls which live in areas sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. So these are areas where fixed internet infrastructure is not present. And mobile technology could be used to reach out those women and girls and illiterate people and provide them basic literacy training. UNESCO launched last year the mobile phone literacy program for empowering women and girls, and annually we're holding the Mobile Literacy Week at UNESCO, and next year it will take place a week before the Business Review Conference in Paris. It will be in mid-February 2013. Thank you.
I think we have a question from our remote participants.
Thank you, Karen. In fact, we have the lead discussion, remote discussion, Hermano Pietro Zemoli, who wants to share by voice his comments.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I am interested in the topic about access because despite all the advances that have been made in providing fiber communications, especially along the coasts of Africa and other continents as well, there is still a lack of penetration toward the inland, and in many instances the rate of return is just not there for typical communication provider to install services in sparsely populated area, in rural areas. So I think that there is room for alternative technologies that are much more cost effective and that can be put forward by small organizations, even local communities. And in this, I want to call attention to the fact that there have been instances of this low-cost wireless communication for data transmission, not just for voice, but to support the kind of services for education and health that are required in a rural area if we want to develop those areas in par with the cities and which have already those kind of services. Furthermore,
Thank you.
I think that there is an opportunity.
Thank you for the comment.
Excuse me?
Do you have the rest of more in your comment?
Yes, I also
Okay.
would like to talk about the possibility of using the spectrum that is currently being used for, or actually allocated for television systems, that can be also used for two-way communication, for data communications in rural areas in which those channels are not really being used. So these are the two things I want to talk about and to call attention about, that are ways to provide connectivity in rural and sparsely populated areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have another question from the floor, and we will ask our panelists to respond to what they've heard. Go ahead, please.
Hello, my name is Natalia Enciso. I am an IGF ambassador and speaking from my capacity. And in many developing countries, the primary means of access is mobile phones. For example, in Paraguay, the mobile penetration is higher than internet penetration. But should we accept internet access through mobile phones sufficient? Should developing countries be demanding more? Thank you.
Okay, one more question, and then we'll turn back to our panelists for responses.
Okay, it's more of a reflection. My name is Christina Alida. I am from the National Telecom Regulator in Egypt, and I also represent the Arab IGF Secretariat. And I would like to welcome the comments that were made by Dr. Tarek Kamel regarding the development of the domain name industry in developing countries. And I just want to make a reflection that this was actually thoroughly discussed in our Arab IGF meeting last month, and participants to the Arab IGF meeting have expressed a call to all international partners such as ICANN and others to actually work hand in hand with the community in the Arab region to develop this industry as actually a catalyst for developing the content industry. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We'd like to keep this part of the panel focused on mobile in particular. We had a lot of really interesting comments. They ranged from regulatory issues and possible technical issues about using unused spectrum, using mobile to get to rural and remote communities, as well as one of the key questions of, is mobile access enough? In the previous section, the report out from the library's workshop noted that sometimes you actually need to print, sometimes you actually need a computer. Should we be satisfied with just mobile phone access for data? So I will turn to Dr. Kamel briefly, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Just two reflections about the comments from the floor as well as from the remote participation. The question from Paraguay asking whether we would be satisfied with mobile access for internet utilization? I think the answer is probably yes. And as it has been mentioned before in the panel, the technology is getting very advanced. LTE is providing today the mobile users with high speed access. We have to have the right policies from a spectrum allocation point of view in order really to make sure that the evolution of mobile internet happens on a wider scale, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa and many parts of the developing countries. And honestly, we don't have another choice because starting to lay fibers and starting to lay expensive infrastructure is going to be very difficult. The second reflection that I want to talk about from remote participation, return on investment for the infrastructure. Yes, indeed, the developing countries are having a challenge, a global challenge for the return on investment on broadband connectivity, whether mobile or fixed, as it has been mentioned in the last segment of our conversation. And it is becoming a global policy issue that the world really is addressing those days. And this can only happen via fostering investment in value-added services and content services, and trying really to foster innovation in this direction. That's the only solution.
Thanks, Dr. Ndemo.
Thank you. I want to respond to the question on use of new technologies to cover areas, especially in Africa, where we have not been able to cover. There is a point I want to make that it is not that Africans cannot afford broadband even in the rural areas. What has been lacking is local content that is relevant to their needs. And the government has a role to play in this. People need services in government and they are not able to access them. They spend so much money to go accessing these services, some of them that can actually be offered through online services. This is where government in Africa must begin to automate, put most of the records into digital formats. You would be able to get sufficient demand to enable the kind of returns we are talking about. We cannot be talking about the returns without creating the demand. And the mobile, accessing internet through mobile, I would say it's not sufficient. If you see what we are doing in Kenya, even where we want to cover with LTE, you must have backhaul through fiber optics to most of the base stations so that you can have the robustness in the last mile. Then the neighboring countries, especially the landlocked countries, we don't see any borders, especially the East African broadband network, which goes into other countries. These are some of the arrangements that can be made. But more important, we must focus on creating content that is relevant to the people. There will be resources because rural people spend millions of dollars trying to access government services. The last point I want to add here, that we have been talking to software providers to change their business models, especially those that have ERPs. We are asking them use the cloud so that SMEs can afford accessing this kind of software and over the services that are necessary. This has paid very well. These are some of the techniques we must use. We must constantly work on the demand side as we have done with the supply side of broadband. Thank you.
I know Satish wants to make an intervention as well as Cecil. But very, very briefly, one last comment, pretty brief, please, from the floor, and we'll take that with the last two panelists' responses. Thanks.
Thank you, Rose. My name is Naresh Ajwani. I'm a president of CCOIA. While I appreciate Mr. Cochrane's referring about illiteracy as a challenge, I wonder that how phones can help, because I personally feel for illiteracy you need an assistance. and the assistance cannot be facilitated through the phones, it can be only through a public internet kiosks. And somewhere we all understand and acknowledge that some kind of a intervention is taking place where even the libraries are closing down and public internet kiosks are closing down, and we really cannot reach to that kind of a segment and that bottom of pyramid without the help of a public internet kiosks. My request would be if the panelists can really make me understand that what are the plans in that regard. Thank you.
Cecil, go ahead. Why don't you take that?
Wow. In a way, the comment I was going to be making, the comment just made takes me directly into it, which is that one of the things that governments must do is that they must create a regulatory framework and foster the development of appropriate data sharing and authentication platforms which will foster innovation in mobile technology. Yes, you have to go to libraries to print as it is, but it does not mean that you cannot transfer information securely over mobile services. And so these are some of the types of things that we need to focus on in ensuring that our peoples or our citizens are able to seamlessly transact business in a secure environment. Minimal need to access additional resources such as printing services, etc., because you can actually spend money online, you can actually exchange money online using mobile phone, etc., etc. We need to ensure that the governments themselves need to ensure that that regulatory framework is in place and that there are investments as well to foster the data sharing platforms that are going to facilitate and ensure that when the libraries close down, so when the libraries close down, people can still exchange information using mobile services without having to go and print things. Thank you.
Thank you. I have two quick points. The first is about the point raised by the remote participant about the low-cost networking. This is obviously quite useful in places where the terrain is very distributed. But there is another use for this which is very important, and I think it should be flagged. And this is for the use in disaster situations when the conventional mobile communication towers have failed or they're broken down. These are very simple and easy to kind of set up and to kind of use. So these are of particular use for disaster situations. The second is regarding edge devices, network edge devices. The debate is on mobile phones. But the definition of a mobile phone is a bit broader than just a hand phone. A mobile device is anything, for example, a pad. A pad is something far more useful, approaching in terms of computational power to a laptop, or even better than that probably. It can be used in a variety of situations, ranging from a fishing boat to an agriculture farm, where the laptop cannot be used. If in a microcredit group, 15 women are sitting under a tree and they're having a meeting, you cannot use a desktop machine there. But a pad is quite appropriate for that context. So what I'm saying is the edge devices of the network are changing, and we have to take into account the fact that we're not talking only about hand phones, but a variety of other devices that are coming up. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And I think that brings us into a nice segue with our next section, which is on human empowerment. In the mobile and innovation area, we touched on issues of e-education, e-health, government services, how to bring things to people in rural and remote areas. And I'll turn it over to Ori to take us through the human empowerment section.
Thanks, Karen. So I've taken a bit of privilege as a moderator to change the question around a little bit. I think the theme was around how women can be empowered, and as a woman in tech who's had a pretty successful run in the last 5 to 6 years in technology, it's an area that's very dear to me. Certainly, I've found technology to be very empowering for me as a woman, and particularly an African woman. I don't think I could have had the career I've had in any other field except for technology. So I'd like us to address this question of from a broader view, from what are the opportunities, because there are opportunities in terms of making the internet access more inclusive, and how can communities, I think we'll address language later on. This would like to focus on women and on the disabled in this particular session. One is around that there are opportunities. You think about things, technologies like Siri and voice search and all of that address perhaps people with challenges. And if you think about things like mobile money and the role it can play for women, and small-owned businesses, which are usually run by women. So there's opportunities on one hand, but there are challenges in terms of their participation, in terms of being harassed online. So I'd like us to tackle those two. What are the opportunities for being more inclusiveness, and what are the challenges, what are the barriers around making the internet more diverse? Jack, if I might start with you first.
I think going back to the initial framing of the question, it also mentioned empowerment. And I think when we talk about empowerment, what we really mean is that how can access to the internet help women realize the full range of their rights? How can it help them really exercise the broad range of their rights? And why talk about women? And I think earlier I'm really appreciative of Yanis to bring up the gap, the issue around literacy and the issue around 2/3 of the world population of illiterate adults are made up of women. And I think literacy is a big issue in terms of access to the internet in the first place. And access is multifaceted. Sorry, I'm tripping over many points, but I think I will refocus by addressing the question that I actually really wanted to respond to, which was raised about mobile phones and literacy. There is a project that started in 2004 in Bangladesh called the Mobile Ladies by DNet. And basically what they did is that they gave working mobile phones to about, I think, 60 women, and trained them on how to use the mobile phone and how to use the mobile phone in order to access information. And then they went from door to door in rural communities to ask women, okay, what are the information that you need, and is there anything that I can help you with? And then they became sort of like the node, the bridge in which to help women who were illiterate, who couldn't read, who wouldn't know how to use the mobile phone to actually access information that's relevant to them, and became that kind of like that facilitator and enabler of information. And in that sense, it really empowered the women who were who needed the information, as well as the women who were providing the information, because it became a source of income as well. So I think in this sense, what has been missing in the conversation this morning when we are looking at access as an issue is that we really looked at the infrastructure level, which is very important. We looked at the economic level, which is also very important. But what we failed to look at is the kind of like the social economic level, which is actually very key in thinking about ensuring access. Because really, who's using this and what is it for? It's for people. It's for communities, and how is this relevant to them? So when we look at women and girls, unfortunately, I think in the previous session 2 days ago, I think it was Teresa Swinehart who said that unfortunately it's still a matter of conversation to talk about women and technology. We haven't arrived at the point where it's no longer a conversational point. And there is a gender gap. I mean, there is a gender gap in terms of access all over the world. This gap is much bigger in developing countries with low internet penetration. For example, in Azerbaijan, 25% of women have access as compared to men. So this is really an issue, and we need to understand why this is this is a reality that we have to contend with and deal with when we think about ensuring access for all. And there are several different layers to this. One is around the cost. So when we talk about cost, then we need to talk about the income and earning power of women, and the majority of women all over the world, and what this means, and whether and the issue of the lack of control and access to resources, and how this also translates into the ability to control and access technology and the benefits of technology. And then we also need to think about issues like literacy, which we talked of before, and also education in science and technology, engineering, mathematics, and why this is still a problem. How is it that we can encourage more girls in order to take up this aspect of education? And a lot of this is actually around social, cultural ways of raising girls and boys differently. You know, we encourage boys to go and experiment, to play with technology and to break things apart, and then we tell girls, oh no, don't touch it, it might break. And this sort of like translates into low numbers in tertiary level, which translates into low numbers of women who take up research in science and technology, which translate into an agenda setting that doesn't include the perspectives and realities of women, which translates into decision making that then has a little bit of a gender gap and blindness, which translate into basically unequal access on this level. So I think it's a quite a complex issue with many dimensions, but we really need to look at it from a holistic way. And to help us in this, I think if we look at it from a rights framework, then we make sure that we don't miss anything out in the process.
Thank you for a great intervention and reminding us the important question of what is this all about, and it's about people. And I think that was the intervention also, the last gentleman who spoke on the floor, trying to bring us back to the human element and how that fits into all the conversations we're having. Peter, if you might share your perspectives.
Thank you. Just to continue on the human aspects, I just want to share you one experience I had coming back from Toronto from the ICAM meeting. I happened to sit next to a lady, a certified nurse of about 75 years of age, who was extremely cultivated, and all of a sudden she told me, I gave back my mobile phone. I don't use it anymore. It's too complicated. Well, I can't get on with that. So I was shocked. I was really shocked, being the co-coordinator of the Dynamic Coalition Accessibility and Disabilities. I've been involved in issues related to disabilities, and this was an example of age-related disability. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a good news and a bad news for you. Life expectancy is increasing. We are going to live longer. The bad news that we are aging. And as we are aging, we are going to have these disabilities. So there are about 1 billion people living with disabilities on the earth, and this number is going to increase. We have a beautiful convention of the rights of people with disabilities, which has been signed, as I said, by 154 countries, ratified by 125 countries, and the number of people with disabilities can feel something of this effect, but probably not much. We have beautiful conventions, we have beautiful standards. Some standards are being implemented. They are very good initiatives, and probably, as I said, the bottleneck is on the local level. Another aspect of this question is the economic aspect. There were studies from the ILO, the International Labour Organization, showing that the disabled people are most likely to be unemployed than able people. The dropout rate is much higher from the workforce, so we should do something about it. And the loss in the GDP, it has been shown that it varies between 3 to 6% of the GDP, which is enormous money due to disabled people not being able to be on the market. So there are lots of actions to be done, and I'm always for actions. Now, just to follow on, ICTs are very good tools to enable people, that is to empower disabled people. But we provided we overcome the barriers. What are the barriers? Well, if you think about visually impaired people or hard of hearing people and other disabled people, probably you can imagine that websites which are inaccessible for blind people are barriers. Even though we have standards, some websites, and even if you think about the mobile applications are still full of barriers. And I can carry on with this list. People who are participating remotely and don't have capture facilities can't really follow it. So there is room for improvement naturally. And basically, I would really call on you to consider this aspect. As I said at the beginning, the bad news that we are going to age as well, and we will be in this basket as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to call on you, Jackie, to respond. But before I do that, Jack, if I can come back to you and bring you a bit down to a more micro, it's a challenge, and you've pointed, through the whole cycle from how the girls are raised to education. But are there one or two things, similar examples to what's happening in Bangladesh that are working, that are practical, that we need to do more of from your experience?
One of the things that we've realized works really well is actually small grants initiative. So sort of like having small grants and giving it to communities in order to set up internet or more like information access points in different communities. So we've done this in parts of Africa and Caribbean. We've tried to facilitate this process. And we found that actually what happens is there's a lot of consultation with local communities on what do you need? What is this center for? How then can we make sure that we have the kinds of infrastructure and technology that is meaningful to you, that you can access, and who are the people, even from the level of who's the person who's going to stand guard there, the opening hours, because it's about mobility issues, it's about safety issues, it's also about like multiple for women anyway, it's about multiple responsibilities that you have to take care of. So I think small grants is something that we can, and it's also a really wonderful multi-stakeholder initiative that we can think of and develop and support more. How can private sector support this together with the right regulatory or policy enabling environment, and working together with civil society groups and local communities to try and empower them through this method.
Thank you. Jackie, did you have any comments?
With such terrific comments already, I'm trying to figure what I can do to add value here. And I think the point about what can industry do to partner with these kinds of things is very important. And let me give you a few examples of the kinds of things that Verizon is doing and others are doing. I'm sure many here or in your own communities. We do focus a lot on technological literacy, and we've done that in the U.S. and globally, and even working with UNESCO on something like that. We do education, science, technology, engineering, and math, a lot of support for that. We recycle our mobile phones to be used by community organizations for those who may be victims of family violence or who would not otherwise have phones, so that they can call if they're in a bad situation. We have a consumer advisory board, we call it, which would be representatives from the disabled and other communities that really give us advice on how to make our products and services accessible. So those are some of the kinds of things. I've also heard many, many stories of the kind of local community projects using even the simplest of mobile phones all the way to the most complex of tablets to deal with healthcare issues. For example, women during their pregnancy being able to be in touch with their doctors just through texting and knowing when to get where if they need more help. So I think there are just a number of things that are very interesting. More we should do. Thanks.
Thank you. And now, before we take questions from the floor and remote participants, Aisha, if you could present the report back from Workshop 91, please. Thank you. The mic is off, I think.
Is that better? Okay, thank you. ICC Basis, APC, and the Government of Kenya partnered this year to organize a workshop on technology, economic, and societal opportunities for women. So this is a feeder workshop for this main session. We had a dynamic a group of speakers and a very interesting group of participants. The workshop was moderated by Erica Mann from Facebook, and we had a really good 90 minutes. To add to what Jack and Jackie have just said, especially, we were focusing on what does it take then to get women to have access, and we identified 3 areas. One was, first of all, the infrastructure. The access issues need to be addressed, so they need to have access, and the policy and regulatory environment issues that make that happen. We also looked at the education and skills building elements that empower women to get online. There was a good discussion about some of the concrete studies that are out there and initiatives by the private sector, by civil society organizations, especially Kikanet in Kenya was discussed. We also focused a bit on some of the cybercrime and violence issues that are connected with the online world, and how sometimes that can force women to stay offline. So how do you empower them to protect themselves online? What are the capacity building and educational elements of that, both for women and girls? There was some dynamic discussion about specific cases of violence that involved the internet and women, and I think that it was a good opportunity for some of the participants to share their concerns, things that have happened to them or their colleagues in country, and also to have some responsiveness from other participants in the workshop. So I thought that was good. There was real interaction, and I think people felt like they got to share some of their challenging experiences. We also looked at how social and cultural norms are a barrier to empowering women or women's access. The whole aspect of encouraging girls to enroll in STEM studies, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. The European Commission discussed some of their initiatives to promote women's enrollment, girls' enrollment in those issue areas. And in conclusion, we thought that this 90-minute discussion was something to be built on again next year, and that these issues should continue to be focused on at the IGF, and that the connection between the online and offline world when we're addressing the legal policy and regulatory environment issues was something that we should deepen our understanding of. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I will open it up to questions from the floor, and we'll start off with the remote participant, and then I'll get to you.
Thanks, Sorry. In fact, we do have a discussion, Chiba Mohamed from Trinidad and Tobago, and then a question from Paraguay. So Chiba's question has already been somehow addressed by both Jackies, but I believe it's a recurrent theme that should be posted to the floor. I would like to take discussion more in depth regarding how we can get more women using the internet to participate more fully and have their voices heard, especially in rural and marginalized areas. In my experience, working with a vulnerable community in Trinidad and Tobago, access was only one dimension. The infusion of practical ICT skills was a key component of building both competency and confidence. We had significantly more women subscribers to the mobile ICT training unit posted there, but there was a coordinated effort to engage the women in the community on a grassroots level. Are there other experiences, and I believe Jack brought one of them, but are there other experiences to share that help women who have been marginalized to effectively participate? That's one of the questions. Can I take the second one?
Yes, I'd actually like to take 3 questions at a time. So maybe the second one, and the gentleman, you can ask your question as well when she's done.
Yeah, so we have Yani Villalba from Paraguay, and she's asking that there are places in which social services do not reach the minimum satisfactory level to respond to the protection of women's rights. How can we foster public policy to give more attention to women's rights? There is no governmental reach or development of capacities to give an answer to women's rights.
Thank you. If you may ask your question. You have to go to the mic there. Is there a mic there? Okay. Well, while we wait for that, maybe we can... Is there anyone... Can you go ahead?
My name is Shadia Buzara. I work with the Web Accessibility Initiative of the World Wide Web Consortium. And to respond to Peter, so the good news actually, it's good news that we're all aging. And the good news is there are accessibility standards to address the needs of people with disabilities and including age-related requirements. What I wanted to talk about is we are talking about access. We're also talking about what content is delivered to engage the people. But what we didn't really talk about also is how the content is delivered. And mobile devices and mobile services are very important for people with disabilities, as is access to the internet, because mobile technology and the internet as a whole provides an equal level playing field for people with disabilities to actually be able to contribute to society in a way that they're not able to in the physical society. So I just wanted to point out that issue as well of how the content is delivered, to include that in the policies. It needs to be designed in a way that it can be used by people with disabilities, including age-related requirements.
Thank you for that.
Hi, my name is Priya and I'm representing the Internet Service Providers Association of India. Just like to underscore a few points that the panelists have made today about how internet is empowering the lives of ordinary people and what impact it is making into their lives. Just a small instance from what India is doing. A lot of initiatives are being undertaken in India. Basically, there's a project called the Unique Identification Authority of India, wherein 1.2 billion citizens in India are going to be provided with a unique identity, and how internet is being used as an empowerment tool to provide access to link the social security benefit schemes to with their bank accounts. So I think and that goes to the point that Jackie made today about whether we have the right policy framework and the environment which would foster and flourish internet in the world. So I think I would agree with the panel, and the discussion so far has been very enriching for us. Thank you.
Thank you for that. If I might give the panel an opportunity to respond, I think I'll start off with the chair who had a few comments she wanted to make.
I have comments on the report participants. It's very useful and very important issue that they raised here. Thank you very much. For my opinion, what's the main, the salvation of this issue? To work with the civil society organizations, because civil society organizations can reach that rural woman, that rural part that women cannot reach, or they cannot any access of internet. So for example, if government can't reach some regions, but civil society can go and do, for example, town hall meetings, seminar trainings on IT, so they can go bilateral or face-to-face discussions to the women. And only, for example, 2 to 5 years or maybe less or more will have any, I think, big results on this. So what we should do, we should be more active in the rural part of the regions where women are not access. They have not access to the internet. They didn't know how to use this. Only trainings, giving informations, and also to go discussions face by face. So civil society is playing a main role on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. And if I might come back, I think that there was a recurring question of that was raised by Shiba, although we touched on it a bit, but also the question from Paraguay on examples around reaching marginalized and rural women, and also on the protection of women's rights. Jack, if I can come back to you, and can you share additional experiences or just your thoughts on those two?
I'm really glad that this question is raised, because not all women are the same. I mean, we are also all in our diversity, and I'm glad that, the issue of some women, there's some degrees of marginalization, and it's also complex and shifting. I think one of the most important things that we need to do in terms of looking at marginalized women and technology and empowerment is not to further marginalize already marginalized women by approaching this through a protectionist framework. So we must not think of women just as passive beneficiaries who are there that we need to somehow protect. And I think sometimes we can fall into this, especially when we worry and bring up issues around risks and dangers and security and safety. What's important, more important, and really the way that we need to ground all approaches is how can we give technology in the hands of women, not as passive beneficiaries, but as active users, definers, shapers, and innovation of internet technologies and content, and understanding what technology is meant to be, even the imagination of it. And this needs to happen at all levels. And when we think about marginalized women, we also need to think about not just in terms of rural and urban, or poor and rich, but there's also women who are with diverse sexualities, with different abilities and disabilities, who work in different kinds of employment, who could be more at risk, for example, migrant domestic workers, and how they've really banded together on the simple tool of mobile phones to provide support to each other in different countries, for example. And that's really, really useful kind of model to really think of, okay, so this is how, women have taken on technology, used it in their context, in their environment, to address very real needs for social support and safety.
Thank you. And then one last intervention. So the question of policy, I think, was also quite strong. There's an intervention from India. And it's a bit of an ambush, but can you speak from the government perspective, just what role policymakers, we've talked about sort of being on the ground, the role of civil society. I'd like to hear your view, given your role, particularly with the USF in your country. What interventions can be made on the policy side?
Certainly, it is important that government makes appropriate interventions to foster empowerment and so on. As it relates to accessibility issues, one of the things that what we did in the government of Jamaica was that we created a web standard which had all the accessibility options built in. But one of the things that we need to focus on and to go beyond, and that, government is a major buyer of services, be it ICT goods or services and so on. And when we buy ICT services from private sector and so on, we need to ensure that their systems as well are compliant with government systems. So we need to create some form of guidelines and standards to say to persons, if you want to do business with government, these are the standards you must adapt in your transactions to ensure that persons with disabilities, etc., are not disenfranchised. Persons who are elderly are not disenfranchised by the services you offer. And this is how one of the things that governments can do to act as a push to ensure that not just governments but also the private sector also creates an environment to ensure that the ICTs themselves are accessible to all. So that, I believe, is what we can do.
Thank you for that. And then I think last question, in the interest of inclusiveness and accessibility, we have a question from a remote participant.
Yes, we do. We are putting on Jerry Ellis, a blind remote participant who wants to share a comment. Let's see if we can hear. Okay, let's.
Hello.
Hi, Jerry.
Hello, this is Gideon.
Gary, okay, sorry for misspelling. We are hearing you. Please go ahead.
Well, my comment was really about the partnership. I'm Gideon Rob from Kenya, .Connect Africa, and I'm happy at the kind of discussions that are going on. What I was going to speak about is the participation between the government and the private sector. If there would be a way to really merge the two and make sure they work together, because most of the time you find that the private sector are the ones who are really pushing and working hard to reach out to the people, especially the marginalized, thereby pushing the government. When the government says that we need to reach out like the private sector, they kind of come in late. So encouraging like organizations so that there is more synergy between the government and the private sector to work together. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Thank you very much. Okay, and with that, I think we will move over to the next session. It's quite an intense agenda that we have here, so we have to keep it moving, even though the discussions have been very interesting this morning. And I'll hand it over to Karen. Thank you.
Thanks, Ori, indeed. Our next topic is on the free flow of information. As we know, fundamentally, the Internet facilitates the flow and creation of information all across the world. The free flow of information and its relationship to human rights and the Internet is an issue that is increasingly becoming more of a focal point. And to go over these issues, I'd like to ask the panelists what they see as the policy challenges around the free flow of information, freedom of expression, and human rights, and the Internet as they relate to access. So I'll start with Yannis Karklins, please.
Thank you, Karen. I think that the departing point of this discussion about freedoms of on the Internet should be the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When we're talking about real world, which the system which we know since 17th century, if I'm not mistaken, Westphalian system, where governments reign within the national borders and are considered sovereign subjects of international law. So the governments in national states regulate and identify or regulate and implement the principles which are agreed in international law. When it comes to Internet, with its borderless nature, that becomes very complicated. Governments are confronted with the situation that they are not any more fully in sort of charge of regulation of implementation of those international treaties and implementation of agreed principles. So because it is very easy to agree on the level of principles, and a very good example is a principle that no rights of one should impinge of rights of others. So we're in agreement. We're in agreement on free flow of information. We're in agreement on freedom of expression as a principle. But when it comes to implementation, the level of implementation in different countries is very different. So that is the policy challenge. We see that there are differences in legal frameworks. There are discrepancies between laws in different countries. There are differences in national and international jurisdictions. The new dimensions also have appeared in this discussion and in this balancing process, and that is how to address issues, contradicting issues of freedom of expression, privacy, national security, intellectual property, and how to balance all these issues in comparison or in ensuring freedom of expression. We also observe that there are different policy approaches to regulate access. We see countries where access to internet is very free, unlimited. We see that there are limitations to access to internet in a number of countries. Some of them, for the reason, has the limited infrastructure and the technical problems. But in some countries, this is a deliberate policy not to develop access to internet simply because that would open the door to access to information and potentially would escape from governmental control. So I think that for all of us, it is very important to note that earlier this year, Human Rights Council adopted resolution on freedoms of internet, where the governments agreed that the same principles of freedom of expression, which are applicable to the real world, should apply also to the virtual world. And I think that this is the very important decision which has been made by Human Rights Council, and that will help us in our advocacy work to ensure and promote freedom of expression, free flow of information. And maybe one final point relates to criminalization, or rather decriminalization of defamation. I think we should be very firm in our advocacy that no speech should be criminalized. People should be responsible what they are saying, but people should not be judged according to criminal law for their opinion and their expression. And I think that this is another element what UNESCO is working on, advocating among member states to decriminalize the defamation and put it under civil law. Thank you.
Thanks, Giannis. In reflecting on Giannis's intervention, one of the comments that he made was about the adoption of the resolution of freedom of the internet, and indicating that rights that apply in the real world should also apply on the online world. And Jaak, a lot of your work has been done around media, done around vulnerable communities, and done around oppressed communities. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you have seen challenges to the free flow of information and the free flow of expression online with those communities and in the context of your work.
I think one of the this was mentioned earlier by Aisha, about one of the major barriers to access is violence against women that happens online. And this is something that is not really defined. We know that it's happening more and more in terms of cyber harassment, in terms of taking private photographs and using it as methods of blackmailing, or in order to kind of discredit people and to use issues of shame and morality, so that they will stop talking about certain things, or they will stop, being active in certain spaces. And I think the issue of this issue we're seeing, it's happening more and more, and we are really trying very hard to first understand the different dimensions of it, who's experiencing it, what does it entail, in what spaces and what forms of harm, so that we are able to also then recommend what needs to be done around this in a way that, because it's complicated, we really want to encourage more women and girls to be able to use the internet to tell their stories, to really share their realities, and that's one of the powers of one of the amazing power of the internet. But at the same time, because of the violence that happens, we also need to make sure that there is adequate redress to deal with this situation, so that it doesn't continue to become a barrier. But how then do we ensure that adequate redress doesn't also translate into further censorship of speech, and to make this delicate balance? And I think the way to really approach this, we always fall back on it really needs to be a human rights approach. This is the only way that we can really balance competing interests in a way that doesn't fall back into a very protectionist framework that unfortunately takes away rights rather than not. That's one aspect of it. And on the other aspect, we also do a lot of work with people of sexual diversities. So, for example, lesbians, gays, transgender, and so on. And for them, the internet is such a critical space in order to be able to find communities, to find information that's not available elsewhere, to be able to connect to other people, information around health, and so on and so forth. And one of the real challenges that they faced in terms of this issue is that the first step that governments take, and also private sector, I suppose, take in censorship and in limiting access to free flow of information is around censorship and regulation of sexual content. And this is usually couched under the framework of pornography, but what this means, how it's defined, sometimes is very loose and very broad. I'll give you an example. In Indonesia recently, LGBT, lesbian, gay and bisexual website it's a website by LGBT organization, LGBT meaning lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender organization that talks about rights issues, and it was blocked and banned under the anti-pornography law. So then, sexual rights then sort of falls into this framework of pornography and harm, when actually it's not necessarily the case, and maybe that's not even the intention. But when we don't talk about it, when we don't really look at these kinds of expressions, as political expressions, or as expression that is really necessary for the realization of rights, then we tend to sort of also not address it in some of our conversations around balancing of different rights and interests, as Yanis was talking about earlier. And I think one last point that I would like to raise is also the importance of, I think, internet intermediaries, people like Facebook and Google, who provide a lot of services and who's a platform that's relied upon by many people online for different kinds of expression, including political expression. I think there is a need to also reflect, okay, how do we deal with expressions that somehow fall into either the sexuality framework or the cultural framework, and try very hard not to err on too much of a side of a caution, because that can be very important aspect of defending for women's human rights or defending for sexual rights. And I think I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that. Satij, what is the relationship here with open source software, open information, and the free flow of information and freedom of expression? Is there a nexus there? Is there a tie there? And is there a threat to open source software, open source models in the context of the implication of rights and information on the internet?
Thank you. The open source paradigm is founded on the concept of freedoms, and when you project that to the broader kind of a picture, it is freedoms that's applied to not just software but also to the societies and communities concerned. Now, it is very clear from the last two interventions that there are some communities today which are defined by the internet. If the internet does not exist, these communities may not exist. So it is literally a life and death situation for some of the communities that have emerged in the last couple of decades. Now, part of the problem that I see, this tension between what the governments want, what the communities want, and what business wants, has to do with the fact that we are trying to use the legal frameworks of the 19th and 20th centuries on technology which is futuristic. It is not just of 21st century, but it is of the future. And this is not an easy proposition to use the archaic legal frameworks on this. As the first intervention mentioned about the model of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think it's a very fundamental, the UDHR instrument brought about a very fundamental shift in thinking. The whole vocabulary, the language that it promoted was new to the world in 1948 when it came about. I think we should be looking for something similar, maybe a Universal Declaration of Internet Rights, where there is out-of-the-box thinking, out-of-the-box a legal instrument which takes into account the fact that we cannot depend on the past, the frameworks of the past, and we have to take into account the uniqueness of both the communities that we have. Our own world has changed, and the fact that the technology is also futuristic. To come to a kind of consensus that will give backing to both nations as well as communities in order to face this challenge of how to balance the often conflicting requirements that each of the stakeholders have. Thank you.
We'll go to the input from our feeder workshops in just a moment. So if Charlie Lewis and Brett Solomon could step up to the mic. And while they are, I'd like to go back to Giannis. Giannis, in your interventions, you were talking about existing protocols, existing arrangements, and their applicability to the internet, which I think with an implication that many of what we have in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is applicable to the internet, in that the freedoms offline should be enjoyed online as well. Satish, however, brings up the point that perhaps a new framework on internet rights should be established, that perhaps the existing frameworks are not robust enough. I was wondering if you might be able to comment on that discussion and have your views on that.
I think that it would be maybe useful to continue discussions about it, but I hardly see what new principles we could develop at this stage, or what new freedoms we could talk about, which are not already addressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Again, I'm not against the debate, but I think that the problem is not that much in lack of agreed universal freedoms or rights. I think that the problem is more in interpretation and implementation of those agreed rights in national states in relation to different social groups, and I would rather personally think we should concentrate on implementation and the balancing of competing rights rather than trying to invent new rights.
Let me take Jackie and Peter, and then we'll go to our feeder workshop. So Jackie, Peter?
I suppose this could be related to what Giannis just said. The topic here is free flow of information, and I wanted to tie together a couple of channels and spaces in which that is being discussed and operationalized, which are very contemporary. So you can see places where there may be restrictions on free flow of information, particularly across borders, where there are governments that may be interested in having international traffic, internet traffic, just go through a couple of gateways or even just one gateway. That may be justified on technical arguments or economic arguments, but it does create a situation in which government monitoring and stopping of certain type of information can occur. So I think we need to be very vigilant about that, as well as certain proposals coming into the ITU meeting for governments to be able to know exactly who originated traffic and what the route has been, and in that way exercise greater control. So that's a place where I think we need to be careful to make sure that bad things do not happen that would restrict the free flow. On the other side, it's interesting to see that international trade agreements are now being used to try to get commitments from governments to allow a free flow of information across borders. So it's driven as a kind of commercial idea, but again, it has implications in terms of internet users and the universal rights that are related to this being captured and advanced in an international trade agreement. So interesting to follow.
Peter, your comments, and then we'll go to our report outs from the feeder workshops.
Thank you. I just want to comment on Yannis' intervention. I fully agree that we have the framework and we have to implement. And in a more concrete way, I would like to call your attention that we are going to have a Taking Stock and Way Forward session tomorrow, I think at the same place, on principles which do apply to the internet and to in particular to the IGF. There are really many principles, and I would like to have you around to discuss these principles and see what we can contribute as an IGF community. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. And we'll go to Charlie Lewis for the report out from Feeder Workshop 57.
Thank you. My name is Charlie Lewis. I'm from the Link Center at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. The feeder workshop here dealt with a particular set of rights. It was looking at broadband access and consumer rights, and really moving from the issue of gaining access to ensuring the quality of the access and the usefulness of the access for the consumers of the services. It's a fairly complex terrain. There are obviously a range of conflicting interests that need to be dealt with. We had a diverse panel, representatives from the private sector, from civil society, from academia, ourselves, Consumers International. There were affiliated organizations from Latin America, India, Fiji, private sector, including the OECD, Ethno, and a representative from Google. Consumer rights and consumer protection in this space obviously relates to the set of rights or consumer rights that exist universally: the right to be informed, the right for choice, the right for redress for consumers, the right of consumers to have a voice and to receive proper education. And we set it against that context. We looked at identifying some of the issues that arise for consumers in the broadband space. And the kinds of issues that came up during the discussion were access and connectivity, the right of consumers to get access to the services. In developing countries, largely mobile 3G services. We looked at quality of service itself, looking at things like bandwidth, at download speeds, at volumes of data. We looked at pricing and affordability as a critical set of issues. We identified misleading marketing, problems with contracts and difficulties of fine print in contracts, billing issues, and the responsiveness of providers, operators to the various sets of complaints. We did note that some of the research that's been undertaken by Consumers International, by ourselves at the Link Center, begins to scratch the surface here, and we felt that more research is needed. We then looked at the kinds of interventions that can be undertaken by policymakers, by regulators, and these include things like ensuring proper legal frameworks and mandates, promoting competition, and implementing regulatory international best practice. There's a range of issues there which I won't go into in the issues of time. And we looked very briefly at a number of other interventions that have come in. We heard about the OECD Consumer Policy Toolkit. We looked at the work that Google has done in their Google Measurement Lab. And there was some discussion around quality of service applications, open source applications. In summary, I think what we feel is there's further research needed in this area, and we feel that this area needs to be taken forward and needs to remain on the agenda. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that report, which puts a little bit of a different spin on the conversation we've had so far, which is the access to the internet as a potential right. So, Brett Solomon, could you give us the report from 157, please? Sorry, we can't hear you on the mic. Turn the mic on.
Okay, that's probably better. I have Access Now. So my name's Brett Solomon. I'm the Executive Director of Access Now. I was the moderator of the panel, Is Access to the Internet a Human Right? And we actually had a standing room only event. We ran out of headphones, which was good and bad, I guess. We kicked off as to and picking up on the point made by the representative from UNESCO as to whether there is actually the development of a new right. We actually talked about what is a human right to start off with, and this questions about, in order to live a full and dignified life in modern society, do you need access to the internet? With the definition being that if that right is taken away, then is a person unable to live in dignity and fully participate in society. I think many people were in agreement that the taking away of that right was actually a breach of Article 19. Whether it was actually codified or could be acknowledged as a human right unto itself was the question that we also looked at in the positive sense. Does the state have an obligation to provide access? The permanent secretary from Kenya, who's actually on this panel, was also on our panel. Jack from APC was also in the audience and made a great intervention. We certainly agreed that it was a serious human rights issue. We had a number of members from the corporate sector, so we had Vince Cerf from Google and the policy director Richard Allen from Facebook. They were concerned if there was a positive right, what that would mean for the obligation to provide service, and in particular whether that would mean greater regulation in the sector, and they were concerned about that issue. Civil society, on the other hand, was like, well, if we have access to the internet as a human right, that enables us to be able to advocate, to be able to lobby. It creates accountability from the state. I don't think there was necessarily a conclusion from our discussion. There was many spirited views, but I think you could possibly say that people thought that access to the internet was an emerging human right, and we're very keen to have further discussion about it as we move forward, and whether the human rights framework itself needs to look at different ways to be able to incorporate these new and emerging rights in order to ensure that they reflect the needs and desires of humans today.
Thanks so much, Brett, for that. I'd like to open the floor to comments and questions. And while people are coming up to the mic, I would like to give Sadish a moment to respond to both Giannis and Peter, who were arguing that it's all about the implementation of current and existing frameworks, and your comment that something new might be needed. So if you just want to take a few minutes or a minute or two to respond to their comments.
Thank you. I think it's very difficult to respond when such an idea is thrown out and placed on the table for discussions, because it's rather new and it may not be easy for all of us to respond to it with any degree of rigor. However, I would say that the reason why I'm saying this is because I believe, coming from the open source community background, where the open source community has invented its own future. And there was nothing comparable to open source when we started off a long time back. Today everybody knows what it is. And that future has been invented, it's been engineered, it's evolved from the community itself. And perhaps, if you had raised this issue 20 years back, maybe people would have said, well, we have enough instruments to handle this eventuality as well, and we may not need anything more than that. So my perspective comes from that, and I believe also that bracketing internet rights with human rights is unfair to perhaps both, because they are, while they overlap to some extent, even to a great extent, they are also very different. And the reason, the rationale for the internet rights perhaps is also slightly different. And the incremental approach to patching our existing legal frameworks to take care of the issues as they arise from the interaction between the technology and society may not work beyond a point. Already we are seeing the kind of issues that come up from that approach. So I would still say that it is important to discuss about an ab initio effort at seeing whether such a framework is feasible and possible, and if so, what would be the elements. As the last intervention from the floor in the workshop, a similar discussion has happened, only they haven't put this label of internet rights as a separate thing. So I think the moment as we open it up, there may be more responses coming from the grassroots. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Satish. And since there's no questions, we'll move right into our next session on multilingualism. And on that session, just as a comment, I think we had a really, in a short amount of time, a quite robust discussion bringing up very substantive high-level issues, including whether existing protocols are sufficient in this area, whether or not new protocols need to be developed or considered, and a range from, should the access to the internet be a right, and also issues of just the free flow of information on the internet and its implication of rights. So we really accomplished a lot of ground in that. And in that score, I'll turn it over to Ori to take us to the multilingual issue.
Thanks, Karen. And thank you, everyone, for powering through with us. We're now at the last session where we tackle the issue of multilingualism, which is very important, particularly in regions and even countries that have multiple languages, multiple communities, and how questions of how do we address that within the world of the internet that might not necessarily be that diverse. The question, if I could frame it with more clarity, is, what are the linkages between local content and multilingualism, for one? And what are the obstacles remaining from a policy, technical, or other realm in terms of accelerating the uptake of multilingual and accessible content? Wearing my Google hat, we spend a lot of time, particularly in Africa, on trying to make our content more accessible, and it's always a challenge between how much you invest and how much you use. We find sometimes, in some cases, people are expressing a need for. They said, "Who told you you want to access the internet in Kiswahili?" And then we're very comfortable with English. I got a lot of hate mail when we changed the default to Kiswahili on our search page in Kenya, to test out this issue of how to make content accessible. And I think there's an interesting debate in terms of not just accessibility, but what about the role of preservation of languages that are at risk of just not being spoken anymore, but can we use technology to preserve language and culture? And you're certainly seeing through National Geographic, companies like Google taking initiatives in terms of preservation. So I think we're going to tackle the two challenges, accessibility and also the preservation of diversity through technology. And if I might, I'll start off with Yanis, if you can tackle that from the UNESCO perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you probably know, for UNESCO, multilingualism is one of the very important areas of our work and our concern. This is the part of cultural diversity. This is the part of everyday's human life, and therefore we take questions related to multilingualism very seriously. The first time UNESCO addressed questions of multilingualism in 2000, multilingualism on internet in 2003, when we developed recommendations for multilingualism on the internet, and we put very much hope in, and we applaud very much the decision of ICANN to introduce international domain names in country space in 2008, if I'm not mistaken, or 2009. If we look back, actually, in general, we have come a very long way in terms of use of different languages on the internet. English was a predominant language in 90s and early 2000, with the uptake of access and growth of use of internet mostly in non-English speaking zones. Today we see that use of other languages on the internet is on the rise. The number of the biggest country in terms of internet users is China. As a result, Chinese language gains a very big prominence on the internet. So we applaud the introduction of IDNs, and we thought that that would be very important facilitator of uptake of using different languages on the net. And from one sense, it is. We saw that there were very big interest among stakeholders in this area. But in order to really monitor and understand and analyze what is happening in terms of IDN uptake, UNESCO together with URID together with UNESCO, that would be more correct, last year started to look at this area very seriously and produced a report on IDN uptake, and this year we developed the second report, World Report on Internationalized Domain Name Deployment in 2012. This is the publication, which is available also online, and this report identifies a number of policy areas which need to be addressed in order to really benefit from opportunities IDN CCTLDs and IDN GTLDs in the future will provide. Technical challenges which have been identified by the report are lack of support by browsers of IDNs, the basically non-existent of IDN email protocol, and that some of the popular services on the net do not support IDNs. So these, and certainly we need to address those issues. Technical community need to look at them, and we know that this is very challenging. Nevertheless, we have invested so much already in development of IDNs that we need also to make this last effort to finalize building the ecosystem supporting IDNs. The second area which has been identified relates to organizational issues related to registration policies, related to existence or network of registrars in countries which provide IDN registrations. So again, these are issues what CCNSO should look at, registrar community should look at, and we're planning to continue analyzing the available data on IDN uptake in order to better understand what is going on and underlying reasons of success or failure, and provide guidance for the future. I think I will stop here and will let others continue to bring this discussion forward. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I think, Dr. Kamal, through your experience at ICANN, you have also some comments and feedback to share.
Thank you, and I want to compliment what Yannis has mentioned. Indeed, ICANN takes the IDN issue very serious and extremely serious, because it is part of the globalization policy and internationalization policy of ICANN. In 2009, ICANN has started specifically for the IDN for the first time a fast-track registration for the CCTLDs, and we have exceeded 30 IDNs for CCTLDs. As it has been mentioned, we have various successes in countries like Russia, for example. We have a clear uptake in Cyrillic in IDN registrations under the Russian CCTLD domain in Cyrillic, but it looks different in the Arab world, for example, whether in Egypt or in Tunisia or in other parts of the Arab countries, the uptake is not that fast. So we look forward definitely working with UNESCO and with other players that are interested in taking this forward, and to work with the technical community as well, talk to them via the IETF and via the various business constituencies that I can have, in order to make sure that the right standards and the right protocols are really put in place, whether for emails or browsers or other types of popular services that are not supporting for the time being IDNs. In addition to that, I would like to mention that also IDN are part of our new GTLD program for the first time. And the new GTLD program has been announced and applications have been received. We have around 1,900 application, close to 2,000 application. 117 out of these applications are IDN application, and this is fairly an acceptable number, a good number as a first round of new GTLD applications. And I am also proud and happy to say that our new CEO and President Fadi Shehadi has announced that during the approval of the new GTLD applications, a priority is going to be given to IDNs. So there is a big debate whether a geographical application should take priority, or cultural applications, or whatever other type of applications coming from business constituencies or civil society. But there has been a decision that has been put forward and taken, that priority is going to be given to IDNs, to the 117 applications to be judged, and those that will be approved will be added to the route. Simply, this is another message of internationalization, globalization, and multilingualism within the domain name industry is taking a priority for ICANN, because this is a base really, as it has been mentioned, for multilingual content industry. We need to look together, as it has been mentioned, on the organizational issues. How should we make the registration steps more easy? The lack of accredited registrars in countries that are working on IDN issues, whether CCTLD or GTLD. We need to empower the registrars. We have within our African strategy that I mentioned before a program to empower accredited registrars and handheld African countries and African startups to be accredited as registrars, not just resellers for other registrars, but really accredited registrars. This will help in the uptake of registrations for the IDN, specifically in CCTLDs as well as in GTLDs. Thank you.
Just a quick question. You pointed to Dr. Kamal. You pointed to the Sorry, a quick question. You pointed to the uptake, the difference in uptake between Russia and, say, like the Arab world. Is that tied to the issues around the lack of registrars, or what is the main difference there?
Well, there are various reasons. Lack of registrars is definitely one of the reasons. All the Arab countries have just 3 or 4 accredited registrars altogether, accredited registrars by ICANN. And recently, as Christine has been mentioning from the floor, we have been looking at that at the Arab IGF in Kuwait, and looking also into possibilities for empowering Arab registrars to be accredited more and more. The Russian CCTLD has put it as a priority, and they have succeeded to link that to content, and they have also managed to have a success as a success case. They have lowered the barrier for registrations as well, and made it more easy, and made it more online and more automative, and the requirements has been also rightly positioned. So I hope that this success story would be repeated in other parts of the world concerning the IDN, because it is the enabler for the multilingual content and the local content industry. And I want to say one final comment, that local content is not anymore geographic proximity, but local content is relevance to user. And if we talk about the Arab world, we have 400 million Arab speaking population worldwide. Only maybe 75% are living within the Arab world. The rest is in the US or Europe or Australia or Latin America, and they all are looking forward for Arabic content. So it's not anymore geographical proximity, but it's relevance to users.
Thank you. And I'll turn over to Satish. Did you have any contributions you wanted to make on this question?
Thank you. I have a few points regarding the issue of multilingualism. One is that there is still a need for standardization, which is more of a technical kind of a thing, on encoding, on rendering, and on things like collation order, which is used for sorting internally. These have been done for most of the prominent languages, but we still have a large number of peripheral kind of languages where this has not been done. This is to be done by the Unicode Consortium, the business, as well as the governments. The next version of the Web 3.0, is supposed to be the semantic web, where the metadata is to be tagged along with the HTML that we all know. Now, unless that happens, the search engines and the other tools will not be able to parse the meanings. So the semantic web and the need to therefore look at meanings on the multilingual space is something that we have to look at. The need for online real-time tools like speech translation, which the text translation does exist, text-to-speech does exist, but the end-to-end speech-to-speech is still very elusive. It will be very useful to have, especially when you have mixed language communities, and it will be a powerful tool to bring together diverse communities. There's also the issue of localization itself. Localization on, for example, the Android platform. This is not yet done completely, and of course, since it's an open source kind of a model, the open source community is also kind of chipping in to do its bit for the localization of the platform. So the localization of Android is in particular very important, because the fact that there is such a lot of innovation happening on that platform. And for the future, much of the local content has also to be local language content. Thank you.
Thank you. And last intervention, Jack, did you want to comment from unless we focused a bit on the technical? I'm hoping you can take us back again to the human.
I'm like the human.
You're the human person. So.
Right. I guess what I wanted to share is just a project that took place a few years ago in Chhattisgarh, India. This is like a small rural community in India, and there was a policy to facilitate direct communication between locally elected representatives of state to the state government. And they wanted to think of, okay, what's the best way to do this? And accompanying this policy was basically another policy that said that 30% of the locally elected representatives had to be women. So this was like a really exciting thing, like trying to think about, okay, how then can we really empower local women leaders at a very local level to also influence policy making at the state level, and let's think of a creative, innovative use of technology. So what they came up with was this thing called a simputer. And this Simputer was a very simple handheld device. It had information that you could use in order to collect particular data or to sort of transmit and communicate particular information or needs back to the state government. And so they really wanted to try and implemented this project in Chhattisgarh. So this is a great project, great vision, and huge investment. So then the question is, how did it work? And did it work well? Dr. Anupama Saxena, she's one of our partners and a colleague, and she did an evaluation on this. She did a gender evaluation methodology on this ICT project, and she said, okay, so did this really at the end of the day help to empower women? And unfortunately, several things went wrong. The first thing that went wrong is that there was only a one-day training on how to use this Simputer. So one-day training is really not enough in order to be able to, for women who are really not used to technology, who are not used to looking at technology and being quite brave with it. So one day was there was an assumed familiarity already with technology. And mobility was also an issue. So they assumed that, okay, you are locally elected women leaders, so you have no problems traveling and you can come to the training center and it's okay. But unfortunately, for many of the women, it was not okay. And it was actually very difficult to try and organize this. And then the third thing, which I guess also directly speaks to our current thematic area, is that most of the content in the Simputer was in Hindi when most of them spoke Chhattisgarhi. So even in that very local level, we really need to think about multilingualism, not just at the national kind of broad strokes, but also at very, very local levels in terms of our solution making and context, and really contextualize it from that aspect itself. And finally, of course, the faulty Simputers always end up with the women local representatives, so they couldn't really use it. And I think this actually brings to us a very useful lesson in thinking through okay, if we have the intention, we have the the political will to really do something, and we want to invest money, but we really need to involve the intended beneficiaries from the very beginning itself, from thinking about the solutions to defining the problem to developing the technology, and that sort of underscores the point.
Thank you. And now I'll open it up to the floor to remote participants. We have a question from a remote participant. Okay.
Hello. I would really, first of all, appreciate UNESCO and ICANN for the efforts. I know UNESCO have been working to make sure that all the languages are able to be focused and to be known in the world. And for ICANN, especially for the IDNs that are being given the priority. My question is about the languages that are going to be, we know there are some certain minority languages, especially here in Kenya, that have never been heard, and some may not even have touched a computer. So what is UNESCO doing to push the governments to make sure that such languages can have content online? I know our PS, Mr. Ndemo, talked about really improving on content and encouraging the young people. So how is it happening so that the young people from those languages, minority languages, can be encouraged to put content online because the internet has a very good memory? Thank you.
Would you like to take the second one? All right.
Yes.
Okay. So we do have a comment from Shiba Mohammed from Trinidad and Tobago again. And she says, language barriers on the internet certainly pose challenges for local groups to access content online. The internet can also provide an opportunity and useful tool for preserving local and indigenous languages. A positive example from a small island developing country has been the ISAC support to Vaha. Now, forgive me for the pronunciation, but Vahahahu Nye project, which aims to indigenous language revival and preservation in the Pacific of Niue. Are there any practical examples that we can point to communities that are using technology to foster multilingual content of indigenous people? And what opportunities are there to use the internet for indigenous language preservation?
I think if you can answer the UNESCO question and maybe speak to preservation as well.
So thank you. Answering the remote participant, the question of remote participant, I already mentioned in my intervention that in 2003 UNESCO adopted recommendations concerning the promotion and use of multilingualism and universal access to cyberspace. In UNESCO terms, a recommendation is a legally binding instrument, and governments have an obligation on the regular basis report on the implementation of these recommendations. This is the way how, putting in your words, dear remote participant, UNESCO is pushing governments to think about multilingualism and promote use of different languages in the cyberspace. Also, by doing studies like, again, one I mentioned on the economic aspects of local content creation, which is very tightly linked with multilingualism. UNESCO is trying to identify additional arguments which could be used in the policy debate and policy guidance for the governments, because if you just say you need to invest in multilingualism, the response from the government can be, we have also other priorities in the country. But if we can argue that by investing in multilingualism you have economic return to your investment, that argument is much stronger than just a policy argument. Please do that. To the practical, concrete examples, or whether UNESCO is working in preservation of languages around the world. A while ago, UNESCO developed the Atlas of Endangered Languages. This atlas was a mapping exercise which allowed us to identify the real situation, and indeed out of more than 6,000 languages, many could be considered as endangered simply because of the number of users and perspective of use of those languages in the future. Whether we are working on the preservation of those languages on policy level, yes. On practical level, I think we have some examples, but the best way would be for the local community which is interested in developing a project on preservation of language by using technology. I would advise to contact UNESCO field offices or office responsible for the country you're living in, and with our experts try to identify and develop the project proposal, which then we would try to implement. Thank you.
I think there was a question directed specifically to Dr. Ndamwe, then we can wrap it up. I think we need to close.
Yes, we are doing a number of efforts to preserve some of the languages. One of the things that the public broadcaster is doing is to ensure that as many languages are able to preserve their culture. We have lots and lots of content that is in different languages, even those that are endangered, that for a long time we have not had a platform to do it, and we are actually looking forward with the new digital platforms to be able to put such content and be able to use them. On conversion of some of the content into the local languages, we also need the participation of the indigenous people to come out and actually help the government in doing so, because the government itself cannot do it without the participation of the people themselves. And our doors are very open to such requests, and we would do as much as we can, even though in Kenya there are two national languages, that is English and Swahili. There is a renewed effort that we look at the endangered languages and begin to preserve those languages. But more importantly, the drive has to come from the people themselves. Then the government can take it up. Otherwise, it will be very difficult if the issue is just left to the government to begin to do it without the willingness of the indigenous groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, we're unfortunately out of time. So I'll hand it over to Karen for a quick wrap-up, and then we can close. Thank you.
Thanks, Ori. Thank you very much to our panelists and to everyone in the audience for this really engaging and interesting discussion. We certainly covered a lot of ground today. We started out with framing the issue of access and diversity more as a value proposition rather than just a binary issue of people who have access and people who don't. We note and in our discussions talked about the various different kinds of issues that make access and diversity really relevant to individuals. In going through, I think even though we had 5 issues that were given to us to be discussed, I think in some ways these can be really boiled down into kind of 3 areas. First, we discussed physical infrastructure issues, talking about the issues of undersea cables, talking about the issues of bandwidth, talking about the issues of mobile and other ways to get sheer access to different communities and those techniques there. We also talked about issues of governance infrastructure, in particular in some of the issues of policy, what governments are doing in terms of promoting infrastructure, promoting mobile, what governments are doing in terms of promoting multilingualism, as we just heard. And we also, the third area, which Ori reminded us of just recently, is probably the most important, discussing issues of human infrastructure, disabled youth and empowerment of people, and how we can preserve and extend culture on the internet. I think that brings us up to the high level issue and the realization that the internet isn't just about computers, wires, and boxes. At the end of the day, the internet is about people. And the issues of access and diversity need to make sure that we are addressing issues that are going to extend human empowerment, extend the value proposition of the internet, and deliver on that promise to all people. So with that, I'll turn it over to our chairwoman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, today's main session was on access and diversity. Altogether, we explored these issues, emphasizing on the social economic development dimension. Officially, this is third day that IGF is going on in Baku. We had valuable and important sessions, meeting, workshops during these days. Within 2 days, there have already been held 4 feeder workshops on these issues. So, as a conclusion, I would like to add that 10% increase in broadband integration can lead to a 3.2% increase in a country's GDP, along with a 2% productivity increase. Broadband internet can play important role in both the economy of a country as well as in the well-being of its citizens. On other hand, one main areas in which broadband can create significant improvement in daily life is women's rights. It should be noted internet is a unique opportunity for all diverse population in the world. should be equal access to diverse population of the world. I would like to thank our moderators Karen, Ori, Claudia and Raquel, and our panelists for leading us in a very high quality discussions, and thank you audience for your questions and your very valuable ideas, and a very sincere thank you to our interpreters that interpret all these sessions. Now I call session closed and pass the microphone to Mr. Masango of the IGF Secretariat.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That ends the session. The next session is at 3 o'clock, Security, Openness and Privacy. Thank you.
Looking